Hi folks, it's Billy Bragg here to answer some of your questions that have arisen as a result of my earlier video reading the introduction of my book, The 3 Dimensions of Freedom. I've got 11 questions here and I'm going to go through them briefly, give you some answers. Question number 1 is, do you think the corona crisis could lead to a general discussion about the dangers and risks of neoliberalism in a global market being driven solely by profit and greed? I do think so. I think that may be one of the positive outcomes. Already we're seeing a move in priorities away from profits and towards people. The idea that companies must prioritize making things that are going to help in the situation, respirators, freeing up beds in private hospitals for the National Health Service here in Britain, recognizing that allowing the market to decide everything isn't a positive way to ensure that everybody gets what they need. I think that may be one of the positive outcomes. Question number 2, what do you think of Greta and the Fridays for Future movement? I think that's very, very positive development. One of the things that I've been sort of annoyed about the last few years is the idea that young people aren't interested in politics or society. It's really not true. It's just they don't have a easy way to manifest that. And what Greta Thunberg has done is she's given our young people an opportunity to come out and show how they feel, to express their solidarity with the planet and with each other. So I'm very, very encouraged by it. Late last year in Cambridge, while I was on tour, I went out with the school students on a Friday marching around Cambridge, and it was just incredible. Some of them were 10 years old, 8 years old, things like that. They were very young. So it's been really positive. I think the whole thing is a really positive development. Question number 3, how many books have you written so far and what were they about? It's a good question. I think I've written 4 books. 4 books. The first book was called The Progressive Patriot, and it was about a sense of society based on belonging, feelings that you are part of what is happening here, whatever that society is. It happens that I live in England, so in many ways it was about England and the traditions of inclusivity and diversity in England. But really it was about a sense of identity that's not based on blood and ethnicity, but is actually based on space rather than race. So it's about where you are rather than where your grandparents or parents came from. So it was trying to make that argument, and that there are things within patriotism that we on the progressive side of politics can connect with. In my country, tolerance is said to be a British value. Can't really say that only British people have it, but it's one of the things that British people like to feel they're tolerant people. So as a progressive, I feel strongly about that. I'm proud of that idea of tolerance. So that to me is part of my identity. A different patriotism would be people who are proud of institutions like the monarchy or the army. That's what they feel proud about. So the argument really is there's not just one type of patriotism. There's different ways, because people feel differently about their country, about their society, about their sense of whether or not they belong. That patriotism is more complicated than just blood and soil or, flags and symbols. It's much more complicated than that. That was my first book. Second book was an annotated book of my lyrics. So loads of lyrics in my songs, and I kind of wrote explanations. My third book was about skiffle. Skiffle is a type of music that happened in Britain in the mid-1950s among schoolboys. It's the music that John Lennon and his friends were playing when they met Paul McCartney. It was hugely influential on that generation of British pop musicians. And it's crucial because it was the type of music that introduced the guitar into British pop music. There weren't guitars before, and afterwards there were. So it's a very important social history as well as a musical history. It's called Roots, Radicals and Rockers. I forgot there for a moment. Roots, Radicals and Rockers, How Skiffle Changed the World. That's my third book. And my fourth book is Three Dimensions of Freedom, which we've already talked about. So, number 4, despite all the egotism and self-interest in society, do you still have hope for accountability? I do. I very much do. I have hope generally. I think if you're going to be a progressive, a person of the left, you have to be able to overcome your cynicism. You have to be able to recognize that the glass is half full. And I think if you can do that, then you can start to feel solidarity with other people. If you constantly think the glass is half empty and everyone's out to get you, it's very hard to have that sense of compassion for other people. In the end, our politics, our progressive politics, are based on empathy, being able to feel the pain that other people feel. And if you can't do that, if you can only see what's happening in your little world and don't have any other idea about what else is happening, I think it's very hard for you to be a person of the left. So I do have hope, not just for accountability, but for society in general. And I hang on to that. Question number 5. What do you expect from politicians in terms of accountability? Is compulsory voting also part of accountability? Well, yeah, obviously compulsory voting helps, but really to answer the first part of the question, I expect our politicians to be accountable to us and not to dissemble, not to lie, not to answer a question without addressing the problem at the beginning of the question, at the heart of the question. So yeah, the real problem, I think, with accountability is how do you enforce it? And in many ways, it has to be a moral enforcement. It has to be a social expectation that if we don't get accountability, then we react firmly, we judge that person, and as a society, we marginalize them. We don't allow liars and the propagators of false information, we don't let them get away with it. We say, no, this is the line. We do not cross this line. You are not listening to facts. You are not responding with truth. And it's tough, but I think it's something that needs to be identified. That line that says this far and no more, it needs to be identified. Is there hope in change for a better world without solidarity and social cohesion? I don't think so, because without those two things, it's every person for themselves. And, you know, that's what happens when you go to the supermarket and everybody's bought 10 great big packets of toilet roll. In the end, we have to realize that we are part of society, all of us. We are products of society. We don't have to conform to everything that society asks, but we do have to recognize that we have a responsibility to one another. That empathy that I was talking about earlier, that's a fundamental human trait. And without it, we are no worse than the animals. So I think, yeah, solidarity and social cohesion are crucial, and one leads to the other. If you have solidarity, the opportunity for social cohesion is much greater. Question number 7. In the current corona crisis, do you see a chance that society moves closer together and overcomes the growing gaps between people and parties? I would hope so. I mean, I'm not hugely affected. Myself and my partner, we're not really affected by this working from home, because when I'm not on the road, I'm working from home. I'm always doing that. But at weekends, we're really bad, because we tend to go back to our computers and spend the weekend on work-related things. We don't have that weekend together unless we're going into town or someone comes to visit. We're very bad at making that time for one another. But yesterday, because everything's closed down, it kind of felt a little bit like we were on holiday. So Julia and I got onto the old streaming services, and we found some great 1940s MGM musicals with Judy Garland and Gene Kelly, and we watched a couple of those. We haven't done that for ages. We had a box of chocolates left over from Christmas. We made a dent in them, and it was just really nice. So I'm hoping other people who are currently having to isolate themselves because of the threat of COVID-19 are finding that time to spend together and making the most of it, and not just kind of carrying on as usual. Question number 8. What kind of research did you do for the book, and how long did it take to write? It didn't take a long time to write because it was only a short book. It was only 17,000 words. My skiffle book, the previous book, was 120,000 words. That took about nearly 2 years. But the thing about the accountability, but the 3 dimensions of freedom, is I've been developing those ideas for a long time. It's like the culmination of maybe 10 years of thinking about the problems that we're facing and why. And slowly but surely over that time, I came to identify the lack of accountability as the problem. Obviously, the election of Donald Trump highlighted that and was like, oh yeah, wow, look there, see what happens if someone can act with impunity. So kind of Trump brought it to the fore for me. But I kind of tuned into it when I was writing the book. And as a result of that, every day there was something in the newspaper that connected with what I was talking about. So I ended up with a big pile of newspaper cuttings and lots of links on my computer, and trying to join the dots for those. So I would say in terms of research and writing, probably about 6 months from the original idea to getting it down, to refining it, to getting it done. Question number 9. If there was a 4th dimension of freedom, what would it be? Oh, then that's pretty easy. If there was a 4th dimension of freedom, it will be happiness. It will be contentment. You know, that if you are content and you're happy, then, you know, that to me is one of the definitions of freedom. So I would guess it will be that. And like all 4th dimensions, it's pretty intangible, isn't it? Like in the real world, the 4th dimension is out there somewhere, but the happiness and contentment equally are out there somewhere for us to try and connect to. Number 10, what fascinates you about politics? When and why did you become an activist in the first place? Was there a special occasion or reason? Yes, there was one person who inspired me to become interested in politics. I'll never forget her name. It was Margaret Thatcher. I'm that generation who were politicized by her actions. Obviously, I'd been a punk rocker in the late 1970s. So I kind of had a connection with Rock Against Racism and a lot of things that I would look back now and say were personally political. But Margaret Thatcher and her policies, particularly the miners' strike in 1984 and 1985, to be involved as an activist in that struggle forced me to start thinking in a much more ideological way and writing songs in a more ideological way. You know, on my first record, there's a song called To Have and To Have Not. Just because you're better than me doesn't mean I'm lazy. That's the chorus. And that's very personal politics. But by the time we get to Talking with a Taxman about poetry, my third album, then I'm talking in a much more ideological language. There is power in a union. And that's because of the experience of the miners' strike. That's what happened in between Brewing Up and my second album and Taxman, my third album. So what fascinates you about politics? Well, it's the fact that it intrudes into our lives. You know, you could ignore it, but it doesn't ignore you. You know, for the last 10 years in my country, the government, the Conservative government, has promoted austerity. And as a result of that, the National Health Service has not been properly funded. As a consequence, now that we're in a crisis with the coronavirus, we're having to deal with how threadbare it is that there's not enough beds for chronically ill people. There are not enough respirators for people with breathing problems, to the extent that the government today was talking about people over the age of 70 having to stay in their homes, possibly for 7 or 8 weeks. That's not really just for their health. It's just to keep them out of beds in hospitals. And that's really shameful. That is really, really shameful. So you could have ignored politics for the last 20 years, but now in a crisis situation, it's that fact that we didn't push harder for better funding for the health service. Old people are going to suffer and some are going to die as a result of it. Last question, number 11. How was it possible that Brexit actually happened? Well, how long have you got? I mean, we could be here all day talking about that one. And one of the good things about Corona is it stopped us having to talk about bloody Brexit. So if you excuse me and forgive me, I'm going to finish here.